The word beside his name in the Roman records was not a name, it was a Greek word, Epictetus, and what it meant was simply that he had been obtained, not born into a household, not given to one, not placed there by the gradual movement of debt or obligation, but acquired as a transaction is acquired, as a piece of land passes from one set of hands to another, and the land does not say anything about it. Whatever name had been spoken over this child at birth, whatever name his mother had carried in her mouth through the years of his infancy, had been set aside before any record thought to ask. What remained was the marker of a legal relation. He had been gotten. He belonged to someone. This was apparently all that the record needed to know. It is a quiet thing to begin with, and worth sitting with for a moment, because it is not a grievance, and it is not a wound. It is the simple fact of how a life entered the historical record, and what that entrance says about the world the life would have to navigate. A person who arrives in the documents already defined as someone else's possession has been handed, before he has formed a single opinion about anything, the central question he will spend the rest of his life answering. He has been told by the structure of the world around him what he is. The philosophy he would build across decades of teaching in a small Greek city would be his very long and very careful answer to that early claim. He was born around 50 years into the Common Era in Hierapolis. The city stood in what Rome called Phrygia, the inland province of what is now western Turkey, a prosperous place of colonnaded streets and warm volcanic springs that rose from the earth at temperatures that seemed to belong to another world entirely. Travelers came to Hierapolis for the waters. They came for the temple of Apollo, for the theater cut into the hillside, for the marketplace where the goods of 3 continents moved between hands, speaking half a dozen languages. The city was Greek in its bones, Greek named, Greek speaking, carrying the long memory of Hellenistic culture inside its Roman present, and a child born there would have grown up in a world that knew how to hold more than one set of stories about what a person was and what a person owed to the city around them. None of that early world has left much of a trace where Epictetus is concerned. His childhood in Hierapolis exists at the edge of what can be known, suggested more than recorded. What is certain is that by the time he appears clearly in the historical record, he is already in Rome, already enslaved, and already inside the household of a man named Epictetus, a powerful imperial secretary who served the Emperor Nero and later the Emperor Domitian, a man who had maneuvered through the most dangerous court in the ancient world and survived. To be the property of Epictetus was to live inside one of the great engines of Roman imperial power, to hear through the walls the business of emperors conducted at volume, to understand, from proximity alone, how completely the machinery of the world could be organized around the preferences of a very small number of people. The household of a senior imperial official was not a simple place. It was populated by secretaries, scribes, attendants, administrators, many of them enslaved, many of them educated, many of them performing work that required real skill and intellectual training. Epictetus was himself a freedman, a man who had once occupied the same legal category as those he now owned, and this gave his household a particular quality, a layering of legal histories that the people inside it could not have missed. Power here did not flow from birth alone. It flowed from proximity to the emperor, from the management of information, from the knowledge of who needed what from whom. Inside this world, a young enslaved man was permitted to do something that would seem, from the outside, an almost absurd irony. He was permitted to study philosophy. Musonius Rufus was teaching in Rome in those years. He was a man of Etruscan origin, Roman by citizenship and culture, and he had developed a reputation as a philosopher of unusual seriousness, not a lecturer who delivered elegant arguments to admiring audiences, but a teacher who believed that philosophy had no value whatsoever if it remained in the lecture hall and did not change the way a person lived every hour of every day. He would later be exiled from Rome twice because what he taught had consequences that made the powerful nervous. He taught that luxury was a form of corruption. He taught that women deserved philosophical education as fully as men. He taught that the purpose of philosophical study was not the accumulation of arguments, but the development of a particular kind of character, patient, clear, undeceived about what was genuinely important, and that any philosophy that stopped short of the way a person actually conducted their daily life had not yet become philosophy in any real sense. Musonius had a way of bringing philosophy down from the place it sometimes retreated to, the abstract heights where the ideas are clean and the difficulty is kept at a safe distance, and setting it down in the kitchen and the street and the hour of genuine pressure. What does it look like to practice philosophy when something goes badly wrong? What does it look like to practice philosophy when someone you depend on behaves unjustly? What does it look like to practice philosophy when the body is in pain, or the reputation has been damaged, or the thing you built is being taken from you? These were not decorative questions for Musonius. They were the point. Everything else was preparation. Into this teacher's classroom, perhaps by arrangement of Epictetus, perhaps by some other route the sources do not record, came the young man who would be called by the name that meant only that he had been acquired. Sit for a moment with the specific quality of that image, a lecture room in Rome, in the household of an imperial official, during the reign of Nero, and inside that room a teacher speaking about freedom, about what it means to be free in the only way that finally matters, about the parts of a human life that no external power can reach or command. And listening, in the very room where those words were spoken, was a person who owned nothing, not even his own legal identity, receiving an education in the philosophy of inner sovereignty, while the empire that had made him a legal object went about its business in the rooms next door. This is not a scene that calls for irony, or at least not the simple kind. The irony cuts in more than one direction, because if Musonius was right about what philosophy was for, and Epictetus would spend his life teaching that he was, then the condition of the listener in that room was not an obstacle to understanding, but a form of clarity that most of the students in most Roman lecture rooms would never have access to. A man who had never been in the situation of having everything external stripped away could understand Musonius's argument intellectually. He could follow it. He could admire it. What he could not do was test it. What Epictetus could do, by the conditions of his daily life, was something else entirely. Ancient sources speak of an injury to his leg. The account preserved by Simplicius, a philosopher writing centuries later, describes a specific scene. Epictetus's master, whose name is given as Epaphroditus, twisting his slave's leg, and Epictetus warning him, calmly, that the leg would break. The master continued, "The leg broke." And Epictetus, according to the account, said only, "Did I not tell you?" Nothing more. No cry of pain recorded. No protest. No pleading. Just the quiet observation that what he had predicted had come to pass, delivered with the same composure as the prediction itself. Whether the scene happened precisely as Simplicius describes it, or whether it is the kind of story that a tradition shapes around a figure to illustrate a truth, the tradition found important, that is not fully knowable from where the records stand. What is certain is that Epictetus walked with a permanent limp for the rest of his life, that the injury was real, and that it stayed with him through the decades of his teaching in Nicopolis, visible to every student who came to study with him. A damaged body, carried through a long life spent teaching that the body is not the self. The philosophical argument and the biographical fact stood in the same room together for years and years, in full view of anyone who cared to look. This is what a tradition sometimes does with a life. It finds the place where the argument and the circumstance align so exactly that the alignment itself becomes a kind of instruction. Whether Epaphroditus broke the leg deliberately, whether it was an accident, whether the story has been shaped by the centuries between the event and Simplicius's writing, none of this changes the essential fact that Epictetus spent his teaching years in a body that demonstrated, visibly and daily, the philosophical claim he was making, that the body is among the things not genuinely ours, that its vulnerability to damage and pain and limitation is not an argument against the life it carries, but simply a description of its category. He knew this. He had apparently known it for a long time. Rome in the first century of the Common Era was a city where Stoic philosophy was not merely an academic matter. The men and women who took it seriously did not take it seriously as an intellectual exercise. They took it seriously because the world around them made certain questions unavoidable. Questions about what a person owed to power, about whether compliance with unjust commands was genuinely neutral or genuinely corrupting, about whether a life lived entirely within the requirements of survival was a free life in any meaningful sense. Figures whose names came up in the educated households of the city, Epictetus, a senator who had made his principled opposition to Nero's conduct so visible that it eventually cost him his life, Helvidius Priscus, who refused repeatedly and publicly to modify his behavior to match the preferences of the emperor. These were men who had understood Stoic philosophy as a set of principles that carried political consequence, that demanded something from a person in the hours when the consequence of the demand was most expensive. The philosophical tradition Epictetus was learning inside Epaphroditus's household was, in other words, not decorative. It was not the kind of philosophy that asks interesting questions and then returns everyone to their ordinary life. It was a philosophy that had been developing in this city, in this century, in direct and often dangerous contact with the question of how a person lives when the world around them is organized around the arbitrary preferences of those with the most power. Musonius Rufus, who taught it, had been exiled for it. The people who studied it understood that understanding it might eventually cost them something. And in the middle of all of this, the court of Nero, the executions, the exiles, the architecture of fear that imperial Rome ran on, there was Epictetus, listening, learning, carrying in his own body and legal status the most compressed possible version of the question that the whole philosophical tradition around him was working on. The Emperor Domitian expelled the philosophers from Rome in 89 of the Common Era. It was a political action, the kind of thing that autocratic power tends toward when the people who ask careful questions about justice and freedom begin to seem, in aggregate, like a threat to the arrangements that make autocratic power comfortable. The philosophers were told to leave. Some went to the edges of the empire, some dispersed across the Greek-speaking East. Epictetus, who had by this point been granted his freedom, the date is not recorded, the circumstances not preserved, made his way northwest, across the Adriatic, to a city on the coast of what is now northwestern Greece. The city was called Nicopolis. Augustus had built it to commemorate the victory at the Battle of Actium, the battle that had ended the civil wars and made his power absolute, and it bore a name that meant city of victory. It sat on a peninsula where two seas met, a crossroads of the Mediterranean world, a place where travelers from Italy and travelers from Greece and travelers from further east all moved through at various times of the year. It was a prosperous city, reasonably sized, with none of the overwhelming grandeur of Rome and none of Rome's particular atmosphere of supervised danger. It was, in other words, a place where a lame freedman of Phrygian origin with a philosophical education could set up a school and attract students without drawing the kind of attention that had gotten philosophy expelled from the capital. Epictetus arrived in Nicopolis without a school. He arrived without a building, without established students, without the institutional authority that the great philosophical schools of Athens had accumulated over centuries. He arrived with his philosophy, which was not yet written down, and which would not be written down until one of his students, a young man named Arian, who came from a wealthy family and would go on to have a distinguished career as a historian and administrator, began transcribing what his teacher said in the classroom. The discourses and the shorter handbook called the Enchiridion, the documents that carry Epictetus's voice forward into the present, do not exist as writing that Epictetus produced. They exist as a student's attempt to catch a teacher's voice on the page before it disappeared. The school that Epictetus built in Nicopolis drew students from a remarkable range of backgrounds and distances. They came from the wealthy families of the Eastern Empire, from Rome itself, from Greece and Asia Minor. Some came because Stoic philosophy was fashionable among educated Romans, and Epictetus was known as a serious practitioner of it. Some came perhaps because something in what they had heard about him went beyond fashion. A man who had lived the questions he was teaching. A man whose leg had been broken and who had said only, "Did I not tell you?" A man who owned almost nothing and seemed from all available evidence to find this entirely sufficient. Whatever drew them across the distances they traveled to sit in his classroom, they found a teacher who was not inclined to make the philosophy comfortable for people who expected philosophy to be comfortable. Epictetus taught in a direct and sometimes abrasive manner. He had no patience for students who attended his lectures the way they might attend the theater, as observers of an interesting performance. He asked them what they were going to do with what they had heard. He asked them what they had done yesterday with what they had heard the day before. He had watched from inside the experience of it what happened to a person who treated philosophical ideas as decorations for an otherwise unchanged life. And he had no interest in being the occasion for that kind of decoration. Philosophy, in his view, was not preparation for living. It was the activity of living, performed with the specific kind of attention that made a difference to every hour it touched. His students sat in a room with a man who had no legal claim to anything in his own history, not his name, not his origin, not his body, not the years of his youth, and who had, across all of that and through all of that, constructed the only kind of authority that Epictetus believed in, the authority of someone who had tested the argument against his own life and found it standing, not because the life had been easy, not because the testing had been painless, but because the philosophy had been adequate to the conditions it was tested under, and the man who had tested it was still there, still teaching, still carrying the same central claim, through the room with the same patient insistence. The students who arrived in Nicopolis came from worlds very different from the world in which their teacher had lived. Many of them had never been in a condition of legal bondage. Many of them had grown up in families where the basic material security of life was not in question. And many of them had come to philosophy the way educated young people in every wealthy society come to philosophy, with genuine intellectual curiosity, with a real desire to think carefully about things that matter, and with the particular unexamined comfort of people who have never had to test their beliefs against the full weight of their circumstances. Epictetus received all of this without hostility and without contempt, but he received it with a kind of watchful patience that his students, from what survives of his teaching, seem to have found both bracing and eventually clarifying, because what he was offering them was not a system, it was not a collection of arguments that could be learned and reproduced and thereby called philosophical education. What he was offering was a practice, a way of turning the attention again and again toward a specific question about what was genuinely theirs and what was not, about what their inner life was capable of and what the world around them would always be able to disturb, and about what happened when a person began, honestly and persistently, to place the boundary between those two regions exactly where it actually fell, rather than where it had always been assumed to fall. This question, drawn from his own biography more clearly than from any abstract source, is what he carried into every room he taught in for the rest of the long life that the records suggest he lived. The ancient sources indicate that he reached old age. Some report that he kept a remarkably simple household throughout, owning very little, living without the material accumulation that his students' families would have considered the natural outward sign of a successful life. There is a story. It has the quality of a story, shaped by what the tradition wished to be true, that the only object of any value in his house for many years was a small iron lamp, and that when a thief stole it, Epictetus remarked that the thief would be disappointed to find it was not worth anything. The story may or may not be precisely true, but the picture it paints is consistent with what the teaching suggests, a life organized around a very careful understanding of what actually needed to be protected, and a corresponding lightness about everything that fell outside that domain. Not poverty embraced as a performance of virtue, not the theatrical asceticism of someone who wants the world to notice how little they have. Something quieter than that, and more specific. The understanding, built through a particular biography into a particular philosophy, of what is genuinely worth holding and what was never worth clutching to begin with. Nicopolis was not Athens, it was not Rome, it was not Hierapolis, the warm Phrygian city where a child had been born and given a name that meant he had been acquired. It was a city built to celebrate a military victory, perched at the edge of the Greek world on the margin of two seas, and there, in a school that had not yet been built when he arrived, and that was never formally endowed or institutionally secured, Epictetus did the work that has kept his name in the record for 2,000 years. He did it without writing anything down. He did it by speaking, year after year, to students who were willing to travel far enough to sit in a room with him, and by teaching through the argument, but also through the visible fact of his own life, the thing that Musonius had taught him and that his own circumstances had given him every possible reason to test, when what the world could take had been taken or had simply never been his to begin with. What remained? The school in Nicopolis was the answer. Not the school as institution, buildings and endowments and official recognition, the school as activity, the daily practice of asking the right question, clearly in the company of other people who were also trying to ask it. It had taken a specific life, shaped by a specific history, to arrive at the clarity required to teach it that way. And the teaching itself, the voice that Arian would later try to catch on a writing tablet, would carry that clarity forward into centuries that Epictetus could not have imagined, speaking to people whose circumstances he had no way to foresee, finding them, still, in the place the question had always found the people who genuinely asked it. The life's most significant work does not always begin from a position of acquisition. It does not always begin from a position of institutional backing or social recognition or material sufficiency. Sometimes it begins exactly where external loss ends, at the point where everything the world can arrange or rearrange has finished arranging itself, and what is left is what was always left, which is the small, durable, entirely unborrowable domain of what the person actually is, and what they actually choose, and what they hold, in the end, as genuinely theirs. Epictetus arrived in Nicopolis carrying that domain intact. The city was there, and the sea was there, and the schools had not yet been built. The teaching was already ready. It had been ready for a long time. Arrian was young when he first sat in Epictetus's classroom in Nicopolis, and he arrived with the habits of a well-educated Roman, accustomed to philosophy as something written, organized, preserved in scrolls. What he found instead was a man speaking, a man who paced, who questioned, who turned a student's casual answer into an hour's examination of everything the student thought he understood. At some point during those sessions, Arrian reached for a writing tablet. The impulse was simple. The words being spoken seemed too important to lose. Not because they were beautiful, though sometimes they were, but because they had a quality that most written philosophy lacked, the quality of something being said directly to a person sitting in a room, not composed for a future reader in a distant library. Arrian wrote quickly, and what he preserved was not a treatise, but a voice. The opening words of that voice, as they have come down across 20 centuries, are almost abrupt in their simplicity. Some things, the voice begins, are in our control, and others are not. The division sounds plain. It sounds like something anyone might say, a practical observation about the way circumstances work, the kind of thing a sensible person murmurs to a friend who is upset about something they cannot change. But Epictetus did not offer it as practical advice. He offered it as the load-bearing architecture of an entire understanding of human life. The entire weight of his philosophy, every lecture, every argument, every question directed at a struggling student in that room in Nicopolis, rested on this single distinction, held with total precision. The plainness was not simplicity, it was compression. Everything that had been gathered from years of teaching, from the careful philosophical tradition Epictetus had inherited, from a life tested against conditions most of his students could not imagine, all of it pressed down into one clean line, placed at the threshold of the text, like a key left in a door. What the line asks of the listener is not agreement but examination. Before any argument can be made, before any doctrine of the good life can be advanced, Epictetus requires a pause, a genuine, honest sorting. On one side of the division go all the things that belong, in his terms, to the domain of things that are up to us. The Greek phrase is epheimon, and it carries the sense of things within our purview, things that fall properly under our jurisdiction. On the other side go the things that are not up to us, uk epheimon, a domain that turns out to be considerably larger than most people walking into that classroom had assumed. The body goes there, property goes there, reputation goes there, the actions and judgments and opinions of other people, all of them go to the side that is not ours. What remains on the first side is narrower than expected and stranger. Judgments, intentions, desires, refusals, the inner movements of the deliberating, evaluating, choosing self. Epictetus had a word for this, a specific term for the deliberative core of the self that the division was meant to identify and protect. The word was prohairesis, which translates roughly as moral purpose or faculty of choice, though neither phrase quite captures what he meant by it. Prohairesis is not merely the capacity to make decisions, it is the evaluative center, the part of a person that assigns weight to things, that determines what matters and what does not, that holds or releases, affirms or refuses. Epictetus considered it the only part of a human being that is by its nature free, not free in the sense of unconstrained, not free in the sense of able to do anything, but free in the specific sense that it cannot be commanded. A tyrant can order the body to labor. A tyrant can confiscate property, damage reputation, restrict movement, end life. But a tyrant cannot order the prohaireses to value what it does not value, cannot compel it to consent to what it refuses, cannot reach inside the evaluative core of a person and rearrange what that person cares about. The jurisdiction of power stops precisely at the boundary of the prohairesis, and Epictetus held this boundary not as a metaphor, but as a fact about the structure of mind. What made this claim unusual? What gave it a texture no classroom argument alone could have produced? Was that Epictetus was not speaking theoretically. The question of what power can and cannot do to a person was not for him a thought experiment. He had lived inside it. The territory of inner freedom was territory he had mapped, not from outside but from within, under conditions that most philosophers of his era encountered only in hypothetical form. When he told his students that the prohairis stands outside any owner's jurisdiction, he was reporting something he had apparently found to be true in practice, not constructing something he hoped might be true in theory. The students sitting in the room in Nicopolis were often young, often free, often wealthy. The man speaking to them had arrived at these arguments from somewhere else entirely, and they could feel the difference in his voice. The division carries a second claim inside it, quieter than the first but equally central. Epictetus does not simply say that some things are inside our control and some outside. He says that all human suffering flows from confusing these two categories. The suffering is not in the loss. The suffering is in the misclassification. When a person treats their reputation as though it belonged to the domain of what is genuinely theirs, when they pour their security, their identity, their sense of good functioning into an external thing, they have made themselves hostage to something that was never, by nature, stable. The loss, when it comes, is not what breaks them. What breaks them is that they had placed something essential in a location that could not hold it. The grief is real, the love behind it is real, but the structure that made the grief unbearable, the belief that the external thing was ours to keep, that was the error, made long before the loss arrived. A student hears this for the first time, and the immediate question is whether it erases everything, whether the doctrine, if taken seriously, would require a person to stop caring about what happens in the world, to stop loving people who might be taken away, to stop wanting things that could fail to materialize. Epictetus did not teach indifference. He made the distinction carefully and with some patience. The doctrine does not say that health is of no value. It says that health is not a genuine good, in the way virtue is a genuine good, because health can be lost without one's consent, and virtue cannot be. It does not say that loving someone is an error. It says that building one's inner stability on the condition that the loved person remains present and unchanged is to place a foundation in territory that does not belong to the self. The grief that follows a real loss is, in some sense, grief for the loss of something that was never, in the deepest sense, ours to possess. The love was real. The value of the person was real. The belief that our continued peace required their continued presence. That was where the false accounting entered. On the harbor wall, watching a ship grow smaller, Epictetus offers a specific image. The ship is sailing away, and a person is watching it go. The ship carries someone they love, or something they valued, or a future they had arranged in their mind with considerable care. The question Epictetus places alongside this scene is not whether the departure is painful, it is whether the watching itself, the quality of attention brought to the moment, the steadiness, or the fracture in the person who watches, belongs to the domain of what is theirs. The answer is yes, the ship cannot be recalled, the distance cannot be reduced by grief, but the quality of the watching, whether the person at the wall is in possession of themselves or given over entirely to what the ship is carrying away, that remains entirely and without qualification within the domain that is theirs. The ship diminishes on the horizon. The watcher remains, and what they do with the remaining is theirs. This is the philosophical move that the Enchiridion asks readers to make repeatedly, on every page, in every situation it describes. Not the suppression of care, not the performance of detachment, but the careful and honest re-examination of where one has placed the things one cannot afford to lose. The irreducible core of a person, the judgments they make, the values they hold, the consents they give or withhold, cannot be carried away on a ship, cannot be confiscated by an emperor, cannot be damaged by an illness or diminished by an insult. This is not because these things are particularly robust, it is because they belong to a different category entirely, a category that has nothing to do with the world's power to give and take. Epictetus drew the line with a sharpness that some students found disturbing and others found over time liberating. In his classroom, he would sometimes describe the act of drawing an invisible division down the center of all experience. Here is what the world can reach, and here is what it cannot, and invite students to place everything they valued honestly on one side or the other. The exercise was not always comfortable. Things that had felt central and necessary, the approval of people one admired, the health of a body one had taken for granted, the continuation of plans made with care and confidence, these ended up, when placed honestly, on the wrong side of the line, on the side of things not truly ours, on the side that circumstances could rearrange without asking permission. The word proheresis appears in his teaching not as a technical term requiring specialist understanding, but as a way of pointing at something the listener already knows from the inside, something that has been present all along and simply needed a name. There is a part of the self that watches and evaluates, a part that can agree or decline, endorse or withhold endorsement, look at what is being offered and say no, that is not worth what you are asking for it. This part, Epictetus insists, has never been touched by any of the things that seem to do the most damage. The damage that was done to the body, or to the reputation, or to the plans. The evaluating, choosing center, the part that reads the situation and decides what it means and what, if anything, it demands. This remained. It always remains. The question is whether a person knows it remains, and whether they act from that knowledge. What happens when the doctrine is applied to something as ordinary as reputation is instructive? A person receives news that their reputation has been damaged. Someone has said something false, or perhaps something partially true, or perhaps something that is technically accurate, but has been deployed with the intent to diminish. The news arrives, and before the full emotional response forms, there is a moment, very brief, easily missed, in which the Epictetean question can be asked. The question is not, what should be done about this? It is a prior question. Whose reputation is this? Exactly. In what sense was it ever mine? The reputation lived in other people's minds. Its condition depended on what those people chose to believe, what they valued, what information reached them, and how. The person who held the reputation, who worked to build it, who cared about it, who arranged their behavior in part around the hope of maintaining it. That person was, in Epictetus's terms, tending a garden in territory that belonged to someone else. The garden mattered, the care put into it was real, but the ground it grew in was never ours to control. This does not resolve the situation. It does not make the damage pleasant or the false report untrue. What it does is relocate the question. If the reputation is not genuinely mine, if it is among the things that were always, by nature, outside my jurisdiction, then the damage to my inner stability, the fracture in my sense of self, is not something the other person caused. It is something I built into the architecture of my life by placing my stability in a location the world had access to. The external event exposed the structure. The structure was built by me, and a structure can slowly be rebuilt differently, with the foundations placed somewhere the world cannot reach. The students in Nicopolis came from educated Roman families. Many of them came expecting philosophical instruction in the traditional sense, debates about cosmology, elaborate theory, the kind of learning that demonstrated cultivation and intelligence. What Epictetus gave them was something less elegant and more demanding. He gave them exercises. He asked them to practice, daily and with genuine attention, the act of sorting. This belongs to me. That does not. This is within my purview. That is not. He treated philosophy not as a body of knowledge to be acquired, but as a discipline to be practiced, the way a musician practices scales, not because the scales themselves are the music, but because the practice changes what the hand can do. The sorting, repeated often enough with honesty enough, begins to change the way the world looks. Not everything at once, not dramatically or suddenly, but steadily, in the direction of a life less easily destabilized by what the world does and does not provide. There is a posture that Epictetus describes, though he does not always use that word. It is the interior orientation of a person who has, through sustained practice, aligned their deepest wanting with what is actually theirs to have, who has moved their desires, gradually and imperfectly, away from the domain of the external and toward the domain of the inner. Such a person still participates in the world, still works, still loves, still takes actions whose outcomes are uncertain, but they hold these engagements with what Epictetus calls, in various places, a reserved intention, an awareness that the outcome belongs to the external domain, that it will be whatever it will be, and that the quality of the engagement itself, the honesty brought to it, the care, the full use of the proheres, is what is genuinely theirs to claim. The proheres, thought of this way, is not an abstraction. It is not a philosophical entity posited to solve a theoretical problem. It is what a person is doing right now, in this room, in this hour, when they decide what something means and what, if anything, it requires of them. It is present in every moment of honest evaluation, every refusal to say yes when the honest answer is no, every choice to maintain one's orientation against the pressure of an external demand. Epictetus held that most people live almost entirely in the external domain, managing the condition of their body and their reputation and their property and their relationships as though these were the real substance of their lives, and that this is the precise source of the instability that makes human life feel so often precarious. The ground keeps shifting because the ground chosen was never ground at all. In the Enchiridion, Arrian preserved a specific image that Epictetus apparently used more than once, the image of an actor in a play. The actor has been assigned a role, a king, or a beggar, or someone suffering a great loss, and the actor's task is to perform that role with full commitment and skill. But the actor does not become the king. The actor knows, throughout the performance, that the crown is a prop, that when the play ends, the crown comes off. This is not detachment from the performance. A good actor is entirely present, entirely committed, but the actor's inner identity is not staked on whether the character wins or loses. The character may die in the third act. The actor goes home. Epictetus offered this as an image for the way a Stoic inhabits a life, fully, skillfully, with genuine commitment to the role assigned by circumstances and by the choices already made, while maintaining an inner clarity about which domain the role belongs to, and which domain the one who plays it inhabits. The image is not cold. It does not describe a person who watches their life from a distance with polished indifference. It describes a person who has found a way to be fully present to what is happening, while remaining oriented around what is genuinely and permanently theirs. The loss in the third act can be genuinely felt. The grief can be real. What the practice changes is not the feeling, but the relationship to the feeling, the extent to which the feeling is taken as evidence that something has gone irreparably wrong with the self, rather than evidence that something real and valuable has moved out of reach. Arrian wrote all of this down in a room in Nicopolis where the light came in at a particular angle in the afternoon, where students sat on whatever was available, where the teacher walked when he was thinking and stopped when he was making a point he wanted them to carry home. Arrian was not transcribing a system, he was preserving a conversation. The Enchiridion, which takes its name from the Greek word for a small handbook, something meant to be kept on one's person, consulted when needed, was not designed as a monument. It was designed as a tool, something small enough to carry, something that could be held in one hand and returned to many times in ordinary hours when the sorting needed to be done again. The distinction between the two domains, what is ours and what is not, does not stop being relevant once it is understood. It requires practice the way all genuine disciplines require practice, not because the principle is complicated, but because the habits of misclassification run very deep. A person understands, in principle, that their reputation is not theirs in the deepest sense. And then the criticism arrives, and the understanding seems to have evaporated, and the sorting needs to be done again. This is not failure, it is the shape of the practice. Epictetus was not teaching his students to achieve a permanent state of philosophical serenity, untouched by anything the world could do. He was teaching them to return, again and again, to the honest question, and to trust that the returning, done with patience and without self-punishment, was the practice itself. The first column, when honestly filled in, is narrow. This surprises most people. They expect the list of what is genuinely theirs to be longer, to include at least their health, their close relationships, their most carefully made plans. The honest list is shorter than that, and sitting with the shortness rather than arguing against it or reaching to add things that do not belong there, this is where the philosophy begins to work, not in the arguing, in the sitting. The narrowness of the first column is not deprivation, it is precision. Everything placed there with accuracy is placed there permanently. Everything placed there is something the world, at its fullest extension of power, cannot remove. A very small domain, held with certainty, is more stable ground than a very large domain held on borrowed terms. In the room in Nicopolis, late in an afternoon session, a student might have walked out into the street still sorting, still holding the question up to the things they had been certain were theirs, finding some of them shifting to the other side. The harbor would have been visible from certain streets in that city. Ships would have been coming in and going out. The air would have carried whatever the sea carries in October in northwestern Greece, and the student would have been somewhere in the middle of an ordinary hour, applying an old question to everything in view. The question Epictetus placed at the center of his teaching does not require a classroom to work in. It does not require a particular time of day, or a particular level of alertness, or a particular mood. It requires only the willingness to hold whatever is being carried, the weight of the day, the weight of what worked and what failed, the weight of what is hoped for tomorrow, and to ask honestly and without urgency, what in all of this is actually mine, not what I want to be mine, not what I have been treating as mine, what is, by the nature of things, genuinely mine. The answer that comes when it comes honestly tends to be smaller and quieter than the question expected, and the small, quiet answer, held without grasping, without insisting it should be more, the small, quiet answer is more durable than anything that has been offered in the other column, for as long as anyone has been keeping track. The prohairse is there, whether it is cultivated or not. It has been making evaluations, assigning weights, endorsing or refusing, all through the day that has just ended, through all the days before it. The practice Epictetus was teaching is not the practice of acquiring something new. It is the practice of becoming accurately aware of what has been there the whole time. The deliberating, evaluating, choosing center present in every honest reckoning, every genuine refusal, every moment in which a person looked at what was being offered and found quietly that it was not worth the price. It was always theirs. It has always been theirs. Whatever else the day brought in, whatever it took, whatever it left in states that were not chosen and could not be altered, this remained, Arian's tablet filled with words. The afternoon continued. Outside, the city of Nicopolis moved through its ordinary hours, the way cities do, commerce and conversation, and the small machinery of daily life, running at full volume, indifferent to the room where a man with a damaged leg was explaining, with considerable patience, why almost none of it belonged to the people who thought they owned it. The question moved from the room into the street, and from the street into the lives of the students who carried it, and from those lives into the text that Arian was building sentence by sentence, page by page, a text that would outlast Nicopolis itself, outlast the empire it existed within, outlast every certainty about what a person could hold and what they could not. What remains when the honest sorting is done is always the same narrow column, the same small domain, the judgments, the intentions, the desires and refusals of the deliberating self. There, inside that boundary, is everything Epictetus considered worth protecting, worth building a life around, worth carrying from one hard circumstance to the next. Not because the world outside the boundary doesn't matter, not because the things that are not ours do not have value, but because placing one's deepest stability inside that boundary, aligning the most essential wanting with the only things that are genuinely, permanently, unrevocably ours, is what makes it possible to meet whatever the world brings without being at the mercy of what it takes away. The night is quiet now. The sorting has been done, or it is not, and either way the question is still there, patient and unhurried, the way a question that has been asked for 2,000 years tends to be. What of everything being held tonight is actually mine? Not everything I want to be mine. Not everything I have been holding as mine by force of habit or hope. What is, by the nature of things, genuinely and permanently in the first column? The answer, when it arrives honestly, is both smaller and more durable than anything that has been offered in the other column for as long as the offering has been going on. And the person who holds that answer holds it without grasping, without insisting it should be more, without adding back what the honest sorting removed. That person is lying on something that will not shift in the night, something that has never shifted, something that was always theirs and will still be theirs in the morning, whatever the morning brings. A student in Nicopolis had been describing an argument, not a philosophical argument, a real one, the kind that happens in a doorway or across a table, where something was said and something else was said back, and then a hand was raised, and then the student had done a thing he was not entirely sure about afterward. He was describing the sequence of events, and somewhere in the middle of the description he had said, "Before I knew what was happening, I had already struck him." Epictetus paused. The pause was not long. It was the length of a breath drawn slowly. A gaze shifted from the student to some point in the middle distance and then back. But the students in the room would have noticed it, because their teacher did not often pause in quite that way, with the quality of a man who has just been handed exactly the thing he wanted to examine. Before I knew what was happening. Those 5 words were, for Epictetus, not a description of the student's misfortune. They were a diagnosis. They pointed to a very precise moment, smaller than the argument, smaller than the raised hand, smaller than anything the student had thought to mention, in which something had passed through the mind, had offered itself as absolutely true and as absolutely requiring a response, and the student had agreed with it before he had noticed the agreement happening. That moment, that gap so small it had gone entirely unobserved, was what the lesson was going to be about. The Stoic tradition had a word for what arrived in that gap: fantasia, an impression. It is a word that carries more than its English translation suggests, because in Greek it holds inside it the root of the verb to appear, to make visible, and a fantasia is precisely that, something the mind receives that appears to be a certain way, not merely a perception of the world outside, though it includes that, but the full event of a thought arriving, carrying with it an apparent meaning, an apparent weight, an apparent demand. The news of an insult arrives as an impression. The memory of a failure arrives as an impression. The anticipation of a difficulty tomorrow arrives as one, presenting itself in the dark hours with all the force of something already real. The impression was not yet a judgment. This was what Epictetus wanted the student to see. The impression was only the arrival of something at the door. What happened next, whether the door was opened, whether what was standing there was invited in and given a chair and treated as a guest with the full rights of a guest, that was a separate event entirely. That was the act the Stoics called synkatathesis, assent. The gap between the impression and the assent to it was, for Epictetus, the most important territory in human experience. Not the widest, not the most dramatic, but the most important, because inside it lived the only freedom that nothing outside could reach. The student had not noticed the gap. He had crossed it so quickly, so automatically, so thoroughly trained by long habit into a particular kind of agreement with a particular kind of arriving impression, that by the time his hand was in motion, the whole thing was already decided. Before I knew what was happening. Yes, precisely. The Stoic account of how the mind is disturbed does not begin with the disturbing event. It begins with a piece of thinking that happens so fast it does not feel like thinking at all. When something arrives, the sharp word, the sudden news, the glimpse of what might be lost, it does not arrive neutral. It arrives already labeled, already sorted into a rough category of good or bad or threatening or shameful, and it is this labeling, not the thing itself, that sets everything in motion. Chrysippus, Chrytsou, Iphthalvari, Chrysippus were penal, 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 who had worked through the logic of the emotions with remarkable care in the 3rd century before the Common Era, had arrived at what seemed at first like a strange conclusion, that what a person feels when they suffer is not simply an irrational storm sweeping through the mind from somewhere below. It is a judgment, a thought the mind has entertained and agreed with, something the mind has done. This is not the same as saying that the suffering is invented, or that the person chose to suffer in some trivial sense, or that the situation was not genuinely difficult. Chrysippus was not dismissing the reality of what had happened. He was asking a more careful question. What exactly is the suffering made of, when one looks at it closely enough to see its components? And what he found, beneath the heat of it, beneath the urgency and the bodily recoil and the sense of necessity, was a set of propositions, a conviction that something genuinely good had been lost, or that something genuinely bad was approaching, or that someone had done something that warranted a particular intensity of response. The suffering was the acceptance of those propositions as true. Chrysippus sat with this insight in Athens, working through its implications in texts that numbered, by ancient report, into the hundreds, most of which have not survived. What has survived is the central claim, passed forward through the hands of every Stoic teacher after him, arriving eventually in a schoolroom in Nicopolis, where a lame freedman was turning it over, in the presence of a student who had just said, "Before I knew what was happening," as though the speed of the event excused the absence of the choice. It did not excuse it. The speed was the exact problem. Epictetus was not a gentle teacher in the sense of soft responses and careful encouragement. He was direct in a way that the discourses, the transcriptions Aurelian made of his classroom conversations, still carry across the centuries. When a student came to him with a philosophical position they had not actually tested in their own behavior, he noticed, when a student claimed to understand the dichotomy between what is ours and what is not, and then described their life in a way that demonstrated the opposite understanding entirely, he pointed at the gap between the claim and the life without ceremony. What he was asking for, always, was not the recitation of the argument, but the evidence that the argument had actually landed somewhere inside the person, had changed something about the way the world arrived to them. In the place where it had to land, if it was going to land anywhere that mattered, was the assent, not the impression that came unbidden, and there was nothing a person could do about the first arrival of a thought, or a perception, or a memory. The first movement, the Stoics acknowledged, was not subject to moral evaluation. A sudden loud noise produces a flinch. A piece of unwelcome news produces an initial contraction of something. These first movements, propathei, the philosophers called them, four emotions, were not themselves errors, and were not within the scope of the discipline. But the second movement, the one that followed the first, as its endorsement and elaboration, the one that took the impression and agreed with it, and held it, and built a whole emotional architecture on the agreement, that was where the work was. A thought arrives in the night that says something is ruined. That is the first movement, the impression. It does not ask permission. It comes with its label already attached, with its apparent certainty already fixed to it, and it presents itself with a directness that makes it feel like contact with fact rather than contact with a thought about fact. This sense of obviousness, of transparent self-evidence, is part of what the Stoics are pointing at when they call an impression cataleptic, gripping, or self-evidently compelling. The impression grips. It presents its content as though no space exists between the thought and the truth of what the thought describes. But the space exists. Epictetus knew this from years of looking at the space, first in a household in Rome, where he had every reason to test whether his inner judgments were independent of his external conditions, and later in a school in Nicopolis, where he was asking his students to perform the same examination under considerably more comfortable circumstances. He had found the space reliably present, not always easy to inhabit, not a restful distance that arrived without effort, but present, always present, available to the mind that had practiced looking for it. The practice was not silence. It was not the forcible suppression of the impression, the attempt to push it away before it could be felt or noticed. Epictetus was not interested in suppression. Suppression was only another way of treating the impression as something overwhelming, something that required emergency management, rather than clear examination. What he was asking for instead was something quieter and in its own way more demanding, the willingness to look at what had arrived before agreeing with it, to hold the impression at a slight distance, the distance of one honest question, and ask what exactly it was claiming to be true. Because the impression is always claiming something. The impression that says something is ruined, is claiming that the thing in question was necessary for good. The impression that arrives with shame is claiming that a certain kind of exposure or failure represents a genuine diminishment of what the person is. The impression that comes with dread is claiming that what it anticipates is something the person genuinely cannot afford to lose. Each of these claims can be examined. None of them is beyond question. And the examination, not the final resolution, not the correct answer arrived at and installed permanently, but the examination itself, the simple act of pausing before the automatic agreement, is what the discipline of assent consists of. Epictetus was teaching this in a city that had been built by the Emperor Augustus to commemorate a military victory, in a school that drew students from across the Roman world. In a time when the distance between a person of his former status and a person of his student's typical origin was enormous, by every measure the world used to take measurements. The students who came to Nicopolis were, by and large, educated men from families of means. Some of them were preparing for careers in the imperial administration. Some of them were studying philosophy in the way that educated Romans often did, as a serious intellectual pursuit with real moral ambition, but also as something a gentleman of a certain kind was expected to have engaged with. Epictetus taught them all the same thing. The lecture room in Nicopolis did not make distinctions that the classroom in Rome had also refused to make. The impression does not ask about legal status before it arrives. The assent does not require money or freedom or a particular family name. The gap between what is received and what is endorsed is the same width in every mind that has ever tried to find it, and the consequences of never finding it are also the same. The life spent believing that the world has full jurisdiction over one's own judgments, carried forward from one event to the next by the force of automatic agreement with everything that appears. Marcus Aurelius found this same lesson indispensable. He was, in the last decade of his life, an emperor conducting a military campaign on the Danube frontier, a man whose days were organized around decisions of enormous consequence, surrounded by the machinery of imperial power, responsible for a civilization. At night, or in whatever hours he could take for reflection, he returned to a notebook. The Meditations, the text known by that name, were not written for anyone but himself. They were not instructions to the empire. They were the private record of a man working on the same problem Epictetus had set for his students in Nicopolis: how to see the impression before agreeing with it, how to remember, against the momentum of the day, that the assent had not yet been given. He wrote the reminders down, not because he had mastered the practice, but because he had not. This is what makes the Meditations such an honest document. A man writing to himself in a tent near the Danube, with candles burning low, setting down again the lesson he had received from his own Stoic teachers. Do not add more to the impression than the impression is. An insult arrives. The insult is the impression, everything built on top of it, the elaborate architecture of what this means about the person who delivered it, about the relationship in question, about one's own standing in the world, is addition, not arrival. The impression itself is only a few words that someone spoke. The rest is what the mind has agreed to do with it. Marcus returned to this again and again in the notebook. Again and again, the same correction, differently phrased, approached from a different angle, as though the repetition itself was the practice, not the achievement of the insight, but its constant renewal, the understanding that the work is not completed and deposited somewhere safe, but performed freshly, in each moment that a new impression arrives. He was not a man who had solved the problem of assent. He was a man who was, every day for years, working on it, in the specific conditions of his specific life, with all the materials that life provided. There is something in this repetition, in the private notebook of an emperor returning to the same instruction his predecessors in the tradition had already written down and passed forward, that gives the Stoic discipline a texture very different from a philosophy that announces its conclusions and invites adoption. The discipline of assent is not an argument to be accepted once. It is not a position to be held theoretically. It is a practice that has to be taken up again in each situation where an impression arrives with its cargo of apparent self-evidence and its invitation to agree. The discipline of desire, which Epictetus placed alongside the discipline of assent as one of the three areas of philosophical training, works by the same principle. Desire, as Epictetus understood it, is not fundamentally the wanting of pleasant things. That is only its surface. At its core, desire is the mind's conviction that a particular external thing is necessary for the good, that without it, something essential is missing, that its acquisition will settle something that is currently unsettled. When the wanting is strong enough to carry that conviction inside it, when it is not merely a preference but a demand, a grasping towards something the mind has judged indispensable, it is not the wanting itself that is the problem. The problem is the added judgment. The problem is the assent. A student in Nicopolis desires reputation. He wants to be thought well of by the people around him. This is not extraordinary. Most people want this, and the wanting has a kind of natural gravity to it, pulling toward approval and away from disapproval. Epictetus does not ask the student to stop wanting reputation. He asks what the student believes about it. Has the student agreed with the impression that says reputation is among the things genuinely necessary for good? Because if so, the student has handed over a portion of his inner sovereignty to every person whose opinion he is now tracking, every room he walks into where he does not know whether the opinion is favorable, every conversation whose outcome might carry back to him in a form that confirms or denies what the impression said was necessary. The retraining of desire does not involve forcing the wanting away. It involves examining the judgment underneath it. Repeatedly, patiently, with the same quality of attention, Epictetus brought to the student's description of the argument in the doorway, not hostile, not demanding, but clear. What are the impressions that accompany this desire? What are they claiming as necessary? Are those claims true? And the examination is not done once at the beginning and then set aside. It is done again when the impression returns. When the wanting comes back with the same weight and the same apparent certainty. When the night offers up the familiar architecture of what is missing. The practice is the repetition. The philosophy is in the returning. Chrysippus had understood this. His long, patient work on the logic of emotion, the 1,000+ texts, the ancient world attributed to him, almost none of which survive intact, was aimed at exactly this, making visible the structure of the thought that suffering is built on, so that the person who is suffering can, in principle, find their way back to the place where the agreement was made and consider whether to make it again. He was not promising a world without pain. He was not arguing that the Stoic sage, that ideal figure the Stoic tradition always held at some distance as a philosophical horizon rather than a real attainment, feels nothing. He was making a more limited and more verifiable claim that the specifically tormented quality of suffering, its urgency, its sense of necessity, its conviction that this loss or this threat or this exposure has jurisdiction over the person's good, is not simply the direct effect of the external event, but the result of a judgment. And judgments can be reconsidered. Epictetus is often read as a philosopher of hard detachment, the reader who comes to him expecting to be asked to become cold, to practice an elaborate philosophical indifference toward the things they care about, will find the text doing something more complicated than that. There is warmth in the discourses, a quality of genuine concern for the students who sit in the room with him, even when, especially when, he is being most direct about the ways they are missing the point. He does not want his students to become philosophically armored in a way that distances them from their lives. He wants them to find the one place from which their lives can be engaged freely, from which they can care about what they care about without being owned by it, from which the impression that arrives and labels itself urgent can be received and examined and responded to, rather than simply agreed with in a rush of automatic compliance. The image he returns to sometimes is of a person standing in a harbor watching a ship sail away. The ship carries something they care about, a friend departing, a plan they had made, a possibility moving out across the water. Epictetus does not say, "Do not watch." He does not say, "Care less." He says, "Know what watching is. Know that the ship was always going to either depart or not depart, or that the departure was never in the column of things belonging to the person standing on the shore, and that the watching itself, the quality of attention brought to the departure, the choice of what to carry from this moment forward, remains entirely within what is theirs. The loss is not denied. The grief is not invalidated. What changes is the location of the claim, whether the departure represents a genuine diminishment of the person's good, or whether the good, the capacity to judge and to value and to choose how to receive what comes, is still, as it always was, entirely present on the shore. A person lying awake in the night has received many impressions by this hour. They have received impressions about the day that has just ended, what was said, what was not said, what went differently than expected. They have received impressions about tomorrow, which arrives in the mind, sometimes as a shape of difficulty, sometimes as a gathering of things that will need to be managed. Each of these impressions comes already labeled, already carrying its apparent weight, already presenting its content as something that requires a particular response, a particular level of concern, a particular degree of the sort of inner engagement that keeps the mind circling rather than settling. Epictetus would not ask the impressions to stop arriving. They do not stop. The mind in the late hours receives what the day has been, and the mind before sleep receives what the mind has been doing with the day. And both of these are arriving as impressions, labeled and offered, and waiting for the response. What he would ask, the only thing he ever really asked, in every lesson and every conversation and every version of the same instruction, the discourses record, is this, before agreeing, before the full endorsement is given, before the elaborate structure of what this all means is constructed on top of what has simply arrived. Pause, not a long pause, not the pause of a man who has spent years in a Stoic school and has at his disposal an elaborate philosophical apparatus, just the pause of a breath taken slowly, the half second in which the impression can be held rather than agreed with, in which the gripping quality of the arriving thought can be noticed, can be seen as gripping rather than as simply true. The discipline is in the pause. The philosophy is in the pause. Everything Chrysippus worked out in Athens, everything Musonius Rufus tested in exile and brought back to Rome, everything Epictetus received in a household where he had every reason to want a shorter distance between himself and his circumstances. All of it narrows, in practice, to this: the willingness to find the space between what arrives and what is chosen, not to guarantee a particular outcome, not to make the impression disappear, only to introduce between the impression and the assent the possibility that the two are separate things, and that the second does not have to follow the first with the automatic completeness it has been following with for years. Marcus Aurelius, in his tent near the Danube, writing to himself in the middle of a military campaign that would last for years and that he did not particularly want to be conducting, writes down something that could have come directly from Epictetus's classroom. He writes, "The obstacle to action advances action. What stands in the way becomes the way." This is not a motivational instruction. It is a piece of Stoic practice, the specific practice of examining the impression that says the obstacle is purely negative, that says it represents only loss and difficulty, and finding in that examination a different quality of agreement available. The impression is received. The assent is not yet given. In that interval, a choice is made about what exactly the obstacle is. He kept returning to the same instructions in the same notebook across years of the same practice. That is the texture of what the Stoics were describing, not the transformation that happens once and then holds, but the practice that holds because it is practiced. The examination of the impression is not a thing done in the first lesson and then completed. It is done in the morning and in the afternoon, and in the late hours, and in the moment just before the automatic response would have arrived. It is done by emperors in tents, and by students in schoolrooms, and by a lame freedman in a simple house in a city on the western coast of Greece, day after day, in the full knowledge that the next impression is already on its way. In the Stoic tradition that Epictetus inhabited and taught, there is no permanent achievement of the state in which impressions no longer arrive with apparent urgency. The sage, that horizon figure, might inhabit such a state, but the sage was understood to be vanishingly rare, perhaps non-existent in any living instance, and the practical stoicism of the schoolroom in Nicopolis was not aimed at the sage. It was aimed at the person who sits in a classroom or a tent or a quiet house, and who is at this hour receiving the day's residue in the form of impressions that carry their labels and their claims and their invitations to agree. The aim was the practice itself. The aim was the pause. The finding of the space, again and again, not because the finding becomes effortless, but because the finding is worth doing in its own right each time it is done. This is what makes the discourses such a particular kind of text. Arian, who sat in the school in Nicopolis and wrote down what his teacher was saying as carefully as he could, was preserving not a system, but a practice in the act of being practiced. The voices of the students are still there, the student who is defensive, the student who has confused understanding the argument with living it, the student who arrives with a situation that is not hypothetical and is not comfortable and needs to be addressed not as a case in a textbook, but as a life in the room. Epictetus responds to these actual situations with the same instrument each time: the examination of the impression, the question of the assent, the redirection of desire from what it has been gripping toward to what it actually has jurisdiction over. The instrument is simple. The simplicity is part of the point. Chrysippus needed 700 works to systematize the full scope of Stoic philosophy, and Marcus Aurelius needed years of returning to the same notes to keep the practice alive in the conditions of his life. But the core of what they were both doing was simple enough to state in a few sentences, and simple enough that a student hearing it for the first time on an afternoon in Nicopolis would feel the shape of it immediately, even if the living of it would take the rest of a life. Something arrives. It presents itself as true. The space between the arrival and the agreement is where everything lives that is genuinely ours to have. In that space, there is no external authority, no emperor, no illness, no other person's opinion, no memory, no anticipation of difficulty that has ever entered without the invitation of assent. What passes through that space without the invitation does not stay. What enters by invitation becomes part of the mind's settled convictions, part of the furniture of the inner life, part of what the mind will automatically agree with the next time the impression arrives. The choice about what to invite, made again and again, in each moment the impression presents itself with its cargo of apparent necessity, is the only choice that was always, entirely, without remainder, genuinely ours to make. In the late hours, when the day has set down everything it accumulated, and the mind moves through what remains, the impressions continue to arrive. They do not thin out with the hour. Sometimes they thicken. They carry their labels and their weights and their sense of obvious self-evidence, and they present themselves to whatever quality of attention is available in the dark and the stillness. The practice does not require effort at this hour. It does not require the reconstruction of an argument, or the recall of a philosophical tradition, or the effort of understanding something new. It requires only the noticing that an impression has arrived, and the recognition that the space between the impression and the agreement with it is still present, still the same width it was this morning, still available, still the only place in the mind that nothing outside the mind has ever been able to enter. The noticing itself is enough. The pause itself is the practice, a mind that has set down its endorsements, not through force, not through suppression, not through the effort of pushing things away, but through the simple recognition that the agreement had not yet been required, becomes something like what the Stoics were pointing at when they described in language that reached across centuries without losing its shape, a mind at rest, not empty, not arrived at some final state of achieved clarity that the examination is over, only still, in the particular way that the mind is still when it has stopped adding its signature to every thought that presents itself as demanding one. The impressions continue to pass through. They do not require response. The night holds them gently, without the urgency they carried at other hours, and the mind that receives them without the automatic grip of assent finds in the finding something that has always been there behind the agreement, something quiet and unhurried and entirely its own. Zeno of Citium arrived in Athens having lost almost everything. The ship that carried him from Phoenicia to the Greek mainland had gone down somewhere in the Mediterranean, and with it had gone his cargo, the purple dye, most likely that ancient sources suggest he was transporting as a merchant. He was not, by training or temperament, a philosopher. He was a man of commerce, practical in the way that people who move goods across open water tend to be practical, attentive to conditions outside his control, because conditions outside his control were for him a professional concern. What he found when he reached Athens was not a school with a door he could knock on. It was a bookshop, and in the bookshop, by chance or by the particular kind of accident that shapes lives quietly and without announcement, he picked up a copy of Xenophon's account of Socrates. He read it standing in the shop. That much, at least, is what the ancient sources suggest. A man recently stripped of his livelihood, reading about another man who had spent his life arguing that the loss of external goods was no loss at all. When Zeno finished reading, he turned to the bookseller and asked where he might find men like the one described. The bookseller, by one account, pointed at a Stoic philosopher who happened to be passing by. Zeno followed him. What followed from that following, the decades of study, the founding of a school in a public colonnade open to anyone who wished to listen, the slow articulation of a set of ideas that would cross centuries and continents and eventually reach a lame freedman teaching in northwestern Greece. None of that could have been anticipated from the doorway of a bookshop in the aftermath of a shipwreck. And yet there is something fitting about it. A tradition that would insist on the irrelevance of external loss began, apparently, with a man who had just experienced one. The Stoa Poikile, the painted porch, was not a private academy. It was a colonnade on the north side of the Athenian agora, decorated with paintings of famous battles, Athenians fighting Spartans, Greeks fighting Persians, the great mythological war at Troy, and it was a public space in the fullest sense, a place where merchants and citizens and travelers passed through on ordinary business. When Zeno began to gather students there around 300 BCE, he was not founding an institution so much as beginning a conversation in a doorway. The setting was itself a philosophical statement, though perhaps an unintentional one. Philosophy conducted in a public colonnade rather than a private garden is philosophy that makes no claim to exclusivity, that offers its ideas to whoever happens to walk by and find them useful. What Zeno offered, at its most basic, was a way of sorting the contents of a life. Some things, he argued, are genuinely good, and on this his position was narrow and absolute. Only virtue, only the quality of a person's will and character, belongs in that first category. Everything else, health, wealth, reputation, the good opinion of others, the continuity of comfort, belongs in a second category, the category of things that are, in the philosophical vocabulary the school would develop, indifferent, not worthless, not to be despised, but indifferent in the specific sense that their presence or absence does not determine whether a life goes well or badly. A life goes well or badly based on what a person does with their capacity for judgment and choice. The world provides the conditions. What a person makes of those conditions is the whole's what matters. This was the founding claim, and it was both simpler and stranger than it sounds when set down plainly. Simpler, because it reduces the enormous complexity of a human life, the losses, the pleasures, the disappointments, the small daily negotiations with circumstance, to a single question: how is the will oriented? Stranger, because it asks a person to hold their own body, their own reputation, their own continued existence in the category of things that do not ultimately belong to them. Zeno had recently watched his cargo sink. He was in a position to consider the question honestly. The school he founded would outlast him by centuries. It would be carried forward by Cleanthes, who led it after Zeno, and is said to have worked as a water carrier at night to pay for his philosophical education by day, and then by Chrysippus of Soli, who transformed the Stoic inheritance from a set of founding intuitions into something more like a complete architecture of thought. Chrysippus was, by ancient report, a man of extraordinary intellectual productivity, hundreds of works attributed to him, almost none of which survive, and what he accomplished was the systematic working out of what Zeno had begun. He examined the logic, developed the physics, and most importantly, for what would come later, he turned his attention to the emotions. The Stoic account of emotion, as Chrysippus developed it, was a departure from what most people assume emotions to be. They are not, on this account, irrational storms that arrive from outside the mind and disrupt its ordered functioning. They are judgments. More precisely, they are errors of judgment, false assessments of value applied to external things. When a person feels intense grief at the loss of a possession, what is actually happening, Chrysippus argued, is that the mind has made an assessment. This thing was genuinely good, and its loss is genuinely bad. The grief is not irrational. It is the precise emotional consequence of a specific judgment about value. Change the judgment. Recognize that the possession was never in the category of the genuinely good, only in the category of the preferred, and the emotional response changes with it. Not immediately, not without sustained practice, but in principle and eventually in fact. This was not a dismissal of feeling. Chrysippus was not arguing that emotions are unimportant or that the philosopher should aim at some kind of affectless calm. The Stoics distinguished between the false emotions that arise from false judgments about external things and what they called the good emotions, joy, careful wishing, caution, that arise when the soul is correctly oriented. The goal was not the absence of feeling, but feeling that had been educated, feeling whose roots went down into an honest assessment of what things are actually worth. All of this, Zeno's founding intuition, Cleanthes' continuation, Chrysippus's systematic development, was happening in Athens in the 3rd century BCE. It was happening in a particular cultural and political moment, in a Greek-speaking world that was adjusting to the aftermath of Alexander's conquests, that was learning to think of human life on a larger and more porous geographic scale than the individual city-state had allowed. The Stoic idea that all rational beings share in a single rational nature, that the Athenian and the Persian and the Macedonian are all, in the relevant philosophical sense, citizens of the same city, had a political resonance that the world Zeno was teaching in was, however unevenly, beginning to make possible. The Stoic school was not building toward the Roman world. It was thinking its own thoughts in its own time, for its own reasons. But the Roman world, when it came, would find those thoughts extraordinarily useful. The transmission from Athens to Rome was not a single event. It happened gradually through the movement of educated Greek-speaking people westward into the expanding Roman sphere, through the appetite of Roman aristocratic culture for Greek intellectual life, through the slow incorporation of Stoic ideas into the practical ethical vocabulary of a society that was, unlike the Athenian polis, an imperial structure of enormous scale and complexity. The Roman Stoics, Cicero engaging with Stoic thought, Seneca adapting it, Marcus Aurelius practicing it in private, were inheriting something that had crossed the Adriatic over several generations, and they were reshaping it as they received it. The cosmological dimensions of the original system, the detailed physics, the theory of a rational fire permeating all matter, the doctrine of periodic cosmic conflagration and renewal, receded. What remained, and what the Roman inheritance emphasized, was the ethical core, how a person should orient themselves toward the goods and losses of a single human life. It was into this Roman inheritance that Musonius Rufus was born, probably around 20 or 30 CE, to an equestrian family in Volsinii in Etruria. He was not, like many of the earlier Stoics, a professional philosopher who devoted himself entirely to theoretical questions. He was something more practical and more demanding than that, a teacher who insisted with considerable force that philosophy exists not to be argued about, but to be done. His surviving fragments, compiled by students and later collected, are notable less for their logical sophistication than for their bluntness. Philosophy that remains in the lecture hall is not philosophy, Musonius held, it is performance. The test of philosophical learning is not whether a person can articulate the doctrine of indifference, but whether they can hold their composure when they lose something they valued, whether they can act with integrity when acting with integrity cost them something real. He paid for this position in the currency he claimed to value above all others. Nero exiled him to the island of Chiara in the Aegean, a rocky, inhospitable place used as a site of banishment for those the emperor found inconvenient. Musonius went. He continued to think and apparently to teach on the island. The exile lasted several years until Nero's death allowed his return to Rome. Under Vespasian, the cycle repeated. The emperor expelled philosophers from Rome in a purge directed at those whose intellectual independence represented a political inconvenience. Musonius went again. He returned again. There is a quality of equanimity in this pattern that the man himself would have recognized as the whole point. The philosopher who argues that external circumstances cannot disturb the inner life, and who then demonstrates, by the manner of his deportations and returns, that the argument holds. It was under Musonius, in Rome, that an enslaved young man from Phrygia sat and listened. What Epictetus made of what he heard in that lecture room is not directly recorded. What survives is the philosophy he would later teach, the philosophy that bears Musonius's insistence on practice over theory, that carries forward Chrysippus's insight about the emotional consequences of judgment, that reaches back to Zeno's founding division of the world's contents into what genuinely matters and what does not. The inheritance was not a set of ideas Epictetus received and transmitted unchanged. He received it, lived inside it in conditions that tested it more immediately than most of his predecessors had faced, and returned it with a quality of authority that comes only from that kind of testing. The school at Nicopolis was not established according to plan. Nicopolis, the city of victory, built by Augustus on the site of his camp before the Battle of Actium, at the point where the Ionian and Adriatic seas meet in the waters off northwestern Greece, was not a great intellectual center. It was a provincial city, reasonably prosperous, with a harbor and a strategic position, a place where the emperor had imposed a memory of a battle onto a landscape. When Domitian expelled philosophers from Rome, around 89 CE, Epictetus went where he could go, that he built something lasting there, that students traveled long distances to sit in a room in Nicopolis and hear a lame freedman who owned almost nothing discuss the conditions of inner freedom, was not the fulfillment of an ambition. It was simply what happened when a person who had thought carefully about something was placed in a position to speak about it. The students who came to Nicopolis were not, for the most part, people whose circumstances resembled Epictetus's own. They were often young men from wealthy and aristocratic families, the kind of people who had time and resources to travel across the Roman world in search of philosophical education. Some came with a specific problem. a difficult relationship, an unwanted political situation, and anxiety about reputation or loss. Some came with a more general sense that the philosophical education they had received elsewhere had not quite given them what they were looking for. Epictetus, by the accounts that survive in Arrian's transcriptions, was not gentle with them. He asked what they had actually done with what they had learned. He wanted to know whether the philosophy had changed their response to the ordinary difficulties of ordinary days, or whether it had only given them new things to say about those difficulties. The distinction mattered to him the way it had mattered to Musonius, and the way it had mattered, though he would not have put it in those terms, to Zeno at the beginning. Arrian of Nicomedia came to Nicopolis as a young student, probably in the first decade of the 2nd century CE, when Epictetus was already well established as a teacher. He would later become a military commander, a governor, a historian of considerable achievement, a man whose public career took him far from the simple school at Nicopolis and deep into the administrative and military structures of the Roman Empire. But before all of that, he sat in a room and listened. What he heard was striking enough that he reached for a writing tablet and began to write it down. His stated purpose, in the prefatory note he later attached to the discourses, was not to produce a philosophical treatise, but to preserve the quality of his teacher's speech, the specific directness, the force, the refusal of abstraction for its own sake. The moments of unexpected sharpness aimed at students who had come with more pretension than genuine philosophical intent. The act of transcription Arrian performed was an act of fidelity to a voice. He was not summarizing Epictetus or translating him into a more formal philosophical register. He was trying to catch in writing what it had been like to sit in that room. The discourses that result from this effort have a quality unlike most ancient philosophical texts. They are uneven in the way that actual teaching is uneven, moving from careful argument to impatient question to direct challenge to something almost like a joke, and back to careful argument, following the shape of a mind at work, rather than a thesis being systematically demonstrated. And the Enchiridion, the handbook that Arrian also compiled, distilling the most practical and portable of Epictetus's teachings into a shorter text, has at its opening what is perhaps the most programmatic sentence in the entire tradition. Some things are in our control and others not. Not an argument, not an invitation to consider a possibility. A line drawn, a division established. The rest of the text is the working out of what follows from taking that line seriously. What Arrian preserved in both texts was not a philosophy that Epictetus invented in isolation. It was something that had been traveling for 4 centuries before it reached him. Zeno's founding division of the world's contents into the genuinely good and the merely indifferent had passed through Clynthes and Chrysippus and the Middle Stoics who carried it to Rome. It had been worked over by Musonius with his emphasis on the kitchen and the marketplace as the true proving grounds of philosophical education. It had been shaped along the way by the political conditions of the Roman world, by the specific problem of living with philosophical integrity inside an autocratic political structure, where the exercise of inner freedom could carry genuine external cost. By the time Epictetus received it, the tradition had been pressure tested for generations. He added the pressure of his own experience, the particular credibility of having held the thesis against conditions that most of his predecessors had encountered only in argument, and he handed it forward to Arrian, who wrote it down. There is something to notice in this pattern of transmission, not a progress toward a destination that the tradition was always approaching, but something more like a conversation that changes shape as the people having it change, that responds to the conditions of each generation without those conditions determining what the conversation concludes. Chrysippus arguing about the logic of the emotions in 3rd century BCE, Athens was not pointing toward Epictetus. He was thinking his own thoughts, answering his own questions, but the thoughts he produced were durable enough and honest enough that when Epictetus needed something to work with in his own very different situation, they were there. When Marcus Aurelius needed something to work with in his, a man navigating the contradictions of absolute political power and Stoic philosophical commitments, writing private notes to himself in a military camp on the Danube, the tradition was there for him too, carrying Epictetus's voice as Epictetus had carried Musonius's, as Musonius had carried Chrysippus's. Marcus Aurelius never met Epictetus. Epictetus died sometime around 135 CE, and Marcus was born in 121, so there was a period of overlap in which both men were alive, but it is not recorded that they encountered each other. What Marcus received was Epictetus's teaching as transcribed by Arrian, the Discourses and the Enchiridion, and in the private notebooks that would later be called the Meditations, he returns to that teaching again and again. He copies out passages from Epictetus. He reminds himself, in his own words, of the distinction between what is up to him and what is not. He practices in private the examination of impressions before assenting to them, the same exercise Epictetus had assigned to students in Nicopolis, who had come to him with their ordinary human anxieties about reputation and loss and the opinions of others, that a man who could command armies and alter the law of the Roman Empire felt the need to remind himself, in the middle of a military campaign, of the basic Epictetan teaching about the limits of what belongs to us. This is its own kind of philosophical evidence. The ideas were not easier to hold because the person holding them was powerful. They were harder, perhaps, and the more important for being harder. The long line of teachers and students and transcribers and readers is not a monument to any single person's genius. Zeno was not, as far as the evidence suggests, uniquely brilliant in the way that Aristotle was uniquely brilliant, with a systematic comprehensiveness that few minds in any century could match. What Zeno had was an honest encounter with loss and a temperament that turned that encounter toward philosophy rather than toward despair or bitterness, and from that encounter he drew a set of distinctions that other people, across a long time, would keep finding useful. Cleans had the patience to carry what Zeno had started through the period when it was not yet complete. Chrysippus had the systematic intelligence to build it into something that could survive philosophical scrutiny. Musonius had the severity to strip away the theoretical ornamentation and insist on the practice. Epictetus had the authority of a tested life, and the voice that Arrian heard and thought too important to lose. Arrian heard it and reached for a tablet. That gesture, the student who notices that something is happening in the room and decides to write it down, is the hinge on which a great deal turns. Philosophers who wrote nothing themselves have mostly disappeared. Socrates survives because Plato wrote. Epictetus survives because Arrian wrote. The teaching that Musonius gave to Epictetus survives only in fragments, preserved by later compilers, and the quality of his voice in a classroom, whatever it actually was, is gone. What Arrian did, writing quickly and trying to catch not just the argument, but the texture of the delivery, was an act of extraordinary consequence, though he could not have known its extent. He was preserving something for students he would never meet, in centuries he could not imagine, in a world whose specific conditions he had no way of anticipating. The Enchiridion, The word means something like a handbook, something carried in the hand, a tool for daily use rather than a monument for admiration, has been read in ways its author could not have foreseen, and in places he could not have named. It crossed into the medieval Christian world through the work of Simplicius, who wrote a commentary on it in the 6th century CE. It was translated into Latin, then into the vernacular languages of early modern Europe. It was read by people navigating political persecution, by people confronting illness, by people trying to find a way to hold their composure in the various ordinary emergencies of ordinary lives. The text itself changed very little. The conditions in which it was read changed enormously. This is not evidence that the teaching was universally applicable in some triumphant way. It is evidence that the questions Epictetus was asking in Nicopolis in the 1st century CE are questions that other people in other centuries, under other conditions, kept finding themselves asking too. The Stoipoikile no longer stands as a working colonnade. Its painted panels depicting the great battles, the sources that describe them make clear they were remarkable works, are gone. Athens, in Zeno's time, is a world accessible only through careful historical imagination. Its streets and light, and the texture of its daily life, reconstructed from fragmentary evidence by people who were not there. Nicopolis still exists as a site of ruins in northwestern Greece, and the remains of the ancient city have been excavated with varying degrees of completeness. Of Epictetus's actual school building, nothing survives that can be confidently identified. Of the room where Arian sat and wrote, nothing remains. What remains is the writing itself, copied by hand through the medieval centuries, and eventually transmitted into printed editions, into translations, into the version a person might read on a sleepless night, 2,000 years after the conversation it preserves was first had. The tradition is not a straight line. It folds back on itself, loses threads, recovers them from unexpected places, moves through hands that had no idea they were carrying something that would outlast them. Musonius, exiled to Gyara, continuing to think on a rocky island in the Aegean, his ideas did not travel to Gyara and stop there. They returned with him to Rome, were transmitted to Epictetus, and from Epictetus to Arian, and from Arian's manuscript to the long chain of copyists who reproduced it without knowing, necessarily, who any of the people in it had been. What moved through all of that was not a biography. It was a set of distinctions between what is ours and what is not, between the judgment that can be examined and the event that cannot be recalled, between the inner life that belongs entirely to the person who lives it and the external world that belongs to no one in any permanent sense. Arian completed his work. He had the discourses in 4 books, 8 books, some ancient sources suggest, though only 4 survive, and he had the Enchiridion, and he had done what he said he set out to do, which was to preserve the force and quality of his teacher's spoken voice. He sent copies of the discourses to a friend, with a letter saying he had not written them for publication, but that now that they were in circulation, he could not stop what might happen to them. He seems to have had some ambivalence about the act of preservation, the sense that writing down a living voice always loses something, that what Epictetus was in a room was not quite what could be held inside a text, and this is probably true. The lame freedman in the school at Nicopolis, impatient with students who had come with more pretension than sincerity, quick to ask whether what they had learned had changed their behavior in the kitchen, or only their opinions in the library. That person is not fully present in the written text. He is present in something like the shape his absence makes in it. But the shape is enough that Musonius's insistence on practice over performance survived in it, enough that Chrysippus's careful argument about the emotional consequences of judgment is still recognizable in its premises. Enough that Zeno's founding division, drawn first in a colonnade where anyone might walk through and overhear, based on a set of intuitions that a shipwreck had made newly vivid, is still there at the opening of the Enchiridion as the first thing a reader encounters, as the line that everything else follows from. Some things are in our control and others not. The sentence is 23 centuries old in one tradition and 19 centuries old in the form Arrian recorded it. It has not been improved on. It has been returned to, again and again, by people who needed it, and it has been found, again and again, to be there. The copy Arrian sent to his friend found other readers. Those readers, over the slow centuries, sent it further. What traveled was not, finally, an argument requiring defense. It was something more like a posture, a way of standing with respect to one's own life, that people kept discovering was livable. Zeno discovered it after his cargo was lost. Musonius discovered it on a rocky island in the Aegean with no clear date of return. Epictetus discovered it in a lecture room in a powerful man's household, listening to someone speak about freedom. Arrian discovered it in a classroom in Nicopolis, reaching for a tablet because the words being spoken were too clear and too direct to let them pass unmarked into the air. The manuscript was copied. The copies were copied. The conversations continued in the directions no one had anticipated, between people who could not have known each other, across a distance that makes the word distance inadequate. What was found to be true in the testing, not in argument alone, but in the specific weight of a life that had pressed against it hard enough to know, moved forward through all of that, arriving, still legible, at the far end of 2 long millennia, in whatever form a person now holds it, in whatever light or darkness they encounter it, at whatever hour the questions that Zeno first organized in a public colonnade in ancient Athens return to make their quiet claim. The house in Nicopolis was not much to look at. Ancient sources note the straw pallet, the earthen lamp, the door that opened onto a street modest enough that no one would have paused to mark it as the residence of a man whose words would be carried forward 2,000 years. And Epictetus walked back to it each evening with the gait that his injury had given him, slow, uneven, the body negotiating its terms with the ground in a way it had always had to negotiate. The school was nearby. The students had gone home. The arguments of the day had come to their various resting places, not concluded but set down, the way all genuine thinking eventually has to be set down before it can be taken up again, clear-eyed in the morning. What a life organized around a single principle looks like from the outside is often something close to nothing. The house was spare because accumulation had been examined and found unnecessary. The door was plain because no display had been judged worth making. The pallet was straw because a man who had established to his own philosophical satisfaction that the body is not the self has little occasion to furnish the body's resting place with anything more than what resting requires. The simplicity was not poverty in the usual sense. It was the residue of a long and serious sorting, everything held up to the question of whether it belonged to the category of what is genuinely ours, and everything that did not belong to that category set quietly aside. There is a word for the thing that cannot be taken. Epictetus used several, but the one that carries the most weight is prohairesis, the deliberative, choosing, valuing core of the self, the faculty by which a person decides what matters and what does not, what to accept and what to refuse. He returned to it constantly, not because it was difficult to understand, but because it was difficult to hold. The mind slides away from it. The world makes constant offers of easier categories: the body's comfort, other people's opinions, the accumulation of objects, and status and safety, and the slide toward these things is so habitual, so well worn by use, that noticing it requires a kind of daily patient attention. The evening was when Epictetus made that accounting. What had been kept clear where the slide had happened, what tomorrow offered by way of practice. The years of enslavement were not, in the way he spoke of them, a chapter that had ended and could be referred to from a safe distance. They were the place where the philosophy had been tested most completely, and the testing had produced a particular kind of authority, not the authority of someone who has read about difficulty and found it intelligible, the authority of someone who has applied a thesis against the hardest available evidence and watched it hold. Any freeborn philosopher could argue that inner freedom survives outer constraint. Epictetus had not argued it from the outside. He had lived inside the constraint and found at the bottom of that experience something that the constraint had not reached. Whether this makes the philosophy more true is a question that can rest open. What it makes the philosophy is more credible. The difference between a claim that has been tested and a claim that has only been advanced is not a small one. The Stoics before him had made the distinction between what is external and what is internal in the clean language of metaphysics. Virtue is the only genuine good. External things, health, wealth, reputation, even life itself, are at most preferred indifference, things a person might reasonably pursue when they are available, but whose absence cannot diminish the self that is doing the pursuing. The argument is elegant. It is also easy to follow in a seminar room, and considerably harder to follow when the thing being classified as an indifferent is a leg under pressure, or a morning's orders, or the face of someone who holds absolute power over the movement of one's body through the world. Epictetus did not modify the argument to make it easier. He held it at its full rigor and applied it to his own experience. And what he found there was not that suffering is impossible, or that the body feels nothing, but that the suffering which comes from misclassification, from treating an external as though it were genuinely one's own, is different in kind from what remains when that false claim is released. What remains, he seems to have found, is not nothing. It is something quieter than nothing, something that has its own kind of ground. In a letter written around the same period, Seneca addressed a friend on the subject of enslaved people in the household. Sit with them, he said, eat with them, recognize in them what cannot be classified as property. The legal category is real, he acknowledged. The human category is realer. What the law has placed in one column, the closer examination of a person reveals to belong somewhere else entirely, in the domain of what no transfer of ownership has ever actually transferred, because the thing in question was never in the domain of the transferable. Seneca arrived at this position from the outside of slavery, from the perspective of a senator of extraordinary wealth, sitting at a writing table in a villa whose scale bore no resemblance to a straw pallet in Nicopolis. And yet the philosophical conclusion he reached, that legal status is external, that what a person genuinely is moves in a different register than what a person is legally classified as, is the same conclusion Epictetus reached from the inside. Two very different lives held against the same question, returning the same answer from opposite directions. This convergence does not prove the thesis, but it has a weight that either position alone would not quite carry. The test case Epictetus returned to most often was the tyrant, not because the tyrant was a likely presence in most of his students' lives, but because the tyrant is the clearest possible expression of external power, the figure who can command the body, confiscate the property, order the death, control every external circumstance that external circumstances can reach. The question Epictetus put to the tyrant was not whether the tyrant's power was real. It was real. The question was how far it extended. A person who, under threat of death, performs a shameful act, who says what the tyrant demands to be said, who betrays what the tyrant demands to be betrayed, has, Epictetus holds, extended the tyrant's jurisdiction into the one domain that the tyrant cannot enter by force alone. The person has invited the tyrant in, has handed over the proheres, not because they were compelled to. Compulsion cannot reach the proheres, but because they valued continued life, or the avoidance of pain, more than they valued what the proheres required of them. The person who refuses, on the other hand, who accepts the death rather than the capitulation, has demonstrated something by that refusal. Not heroism in the theatrical sense, something closer to a philosophical proof. They have shown, by the demonstration of their own life, that there is in fact a domain the tyrant cannot enter. The jurisdiction ends somewhere. The wall is real. Epictetus did not present this as a counsel for seeking death or finding glory in suffering. He presented it as a clarification of the map. The wall exists whether or not it is ever tested. The domain exists whether or not a tyrant ever arrives to press against it. Most evenings there is no tyrant and no extreme demand, and the work of maintaining the boundary is quieter than that. It is the ordinary practice of noticing when the proheres is being invited to trade itself for something that belongs in the other column and declining the trade, not with drama, but with the calm of a person who has done this accounting often enough that it no longer requires a great effort to see which side of the line things fall on. In the middle of the 20th century, in conditions that no ancient philosopher had described, because no ancient philosopher had imagined them, a man named Viktor Frankl made the same discovery about the same wall. The conditions of the Nazi concentration camps were designed, among other things, to demonstrate that no such wall existed, that total domination of the body, the labor, the daily circumstance, the knowledge of one's fate, was also total domination of the person. What Frankl found in the space between what was done to him and what he chose to make of it was that the space itself refused to close. Something persisted, not comfort, not the absence of suffering, not the philosophical serenity of a man in a comfortable study working through an abstract proposition, something that remained in conditions designed to eliminate everything that remained. He did not have the word proheres. He had the experience that the word names, and he returned from it with the same report that Epictetus had made from his own different version of that experience, that the last of the human freedoms is the freedom to choose one's response to one's situation, and that this freedom cannot be confiscated because it lives in the only domain that confiscation cannot reach. That two people, separated by 19 centuries and conditions whose differences are almost too large to hold together in one frame, arrived at the same structural description of the same interior space, is not in the end surprising to a Stoic. Epictetus would have said that what they were both finding is not a discovery, but a recognition, the mind noticing something about its own architecture that was always there, that has always been there, that will continue to be there, not a truth that history uncovered at a particular moment, but a feature of what it is to be a choosing, valuing, consenting being, present in every version of that being that has ever existed, obscured by comfort, clarified by pressure, visible when everything else has been stripped away. The practice Epictetus assigned his students at the end of each day was a form of accounting, not a performance of self-blame, and not a ledger of achievement, but a quiet, honest review. Where had the day gone well? Where had the slide happened? Where had something external been grasped at as though it were genuinely one's own? Where had another person's opinion been allowed to carry more weight than the proheriasis? Where had the body's discomfort or the mind's anxiety been granted the status of genuine harm rather than indifferent circumstance? The review was not meant to produce guilt, it was meant to produce clarity. The difference between a person who examines the day and a person who does not is, over a long enough time, substantial, not because the examination makes the days better in some immediate sense, but because the practice of honestly noticing builds a familiarity with the terrain of one's own interior that makes the slide less automatic, the recovery quicker, the maintenance of the boundary less effortful. Clarity accumulated becomes something close to habit. Habit in the domain of the proheriasis becomes something close to character. And character, Epictetus held, is what remains when everything else has been set down for the night. A person lying in the dark at the end of a day is already doing something close to this accounting, whether or not they have ever heard the name Epictetus. The day passes through the mind in fragments. This was managed well. This was not. Here the frustration was larger than the situation required. Here something was said that cost something in the saying. The mind returns to these moments, not because returning to them is particularly useful, but because something in the reviewing is simply what the mind does when the external demands of the day release their hold. Epictetus's contribution to this natural review is not to add a formal structure to something spontaneous, but to offer a frame for what the review is actually about. The question is not whether the day was good or bad in the general sense. Those words carry. The question is where the line held and where it did not, where the proheriasis kept its orientation and where it handed over a piece of its sovereignty in exchange for something that turned out to belong in the other column. This is a more precise question. B. And precision in the Epictetian account is not a philosophical luxury, it is the practice itself. The house in Nicopolis did not ask anything of its inhabitant. This is worth dwelling on for a moment, because it stands against a kind of background noise that most lives generate, the noise of possessions requiring maintenance, of status requiring defense, of relationships requiring management, according to what the other person thinks of them, of the body's comfort requiring constant anticipation and provision. The house asked for almost none of this, not because Epictetus had achieved the absence of all need, but because the process of examination had run its course long enough that most of what generates that noise had been recognized for what it was, an investment in the wrong column, and released. The release was not a renunciation in the theatrical sense. It was more like a gradual and quiet settling into a smaller, more honest inventory. This is mine. This is not mine. This, here. This faculty of valuing and choosing and consenting. This is mine, and this no one has ever taken, and no one could take, even when everything else was taken, even in the years when everything else was taken. What the outside of such a life looks like to someone passing the door is a plain house and a lame old man. What the inside of such a life is, by Epictetus's own account, is a kind of freedom most people who own considerably more have not found, not because it requires the renunciation of those things, but because it requires the clear-eyed recognition of what those things are and what they are not. And the recognition has a way of organizing itself around what it finds at the center, which is always the same small domain, always the same answer to the same question, always the same quiet fact about the architecture of choosing. Seneca's letter to Lucilius on the subject of enslaved members of the household ends with a sentence that has been turning in the minds of readers ever since he wrote it. Treat them as you would wish to be treated, he said, not as a moral instruction, though it carries moral weight, but as a philosophical observation about what kind of treatment corresponds to what kind of thing a person actually is. A person is not a body to be managed, not a labor unit to be directed, not an opinion to be shaped. A person is a prohairesis, a choosing faculty, a valuing core, and what treatment corresponds to that kind of thing is treatment that acknowledges the faculty's existence and does not attempt to circumvent it. The wealthy senator writing this in his villa, and the freed philosopher writing nothing in his simple house in Nicopolis, were not arriving at the same conclusion by accident. They were looking at the same thing from different angles and describing what they saw with the vocabulary they had each inherited and tested. What they saw was real. The vocabulary was adequate to it. The description has held. The thread running from Zeno's colonnade in Athens through the long centuries of the school's development, through Musonius's exile and return, and exile again, through the room in Rome where an enslaved young man sat listening to a Stoic teacher speak about freedom, through the school at Nicopolis and the straw pallet and the unwritten lectures that Arian caught as best he could on the page. This thread does not lead anywhere in the sense of arriving at a final answer. The questions it carries are not the kind that final answers fit. They are the kind that the more carefully they are examined, the more clearly they reveal themselves as permanently open. Not because the examination has failed, but because the openness is part of what the questions are, what is truly mine, where do I end, and what I am not end, what can be taken from me, and what cannot. These are not puzzles awaiting the right key. They are orientations, ways of standing in relation to a life that go on being refined as long as the life continues. The body breathes in the dark. This is happening now, in the simple house in Nicopolis, and in every room where a person has set down the day's questions and found themselves still here, still breathing, still in possession of the one faculty that the day's events, whatever they were, whatever pressures they exerted, whatever they offered and withheld, did not manage to reach. The breath moves without being commanded. The body knows what it is doing without being instructed. In the simplest of all biological facts, the chest rising, the chest falling, the air finding its way in and finding its way back out, there is something the Stoics recognized as a figure of what they were pointing at. Not the breath itself, which is the body's, which is external in the technical sense, which can be interrupted and will eventually stop, but the quality of noticing the breath,